We have breaking news. We have been waiting for the judge to make a decision on the request by Donald Trump's lawyers to block his Friday sentencing in the hush money case. Let me bring in former Assistant Manhattan DA and MSNBC legal analyst Catherine Christian. And here on set with us, legal correspondent Lisa Rubin. It's very short. The stay is denied. That doesn't necessarily mean he'll be sentenced on Friday, does it?
No, it doesn't. And in fact, there are still minutes left in this game, if we're making a sports analogy. The appellate division, where Donald Trump is now, usually cases are heard by a panel of multiple judges, as Catherine was noting earlier. An emergency motion like this can be heard by a single judge. The problem that Donald Trump has now in terms of blocking the sentence on Friday is that the next time we understand that a full panel could be together is January 27th. That obviously doesn't bring him to a place where he can block the sentencing before he takes office. So I predict that his next move is to go to New York's highest court, the Court of Appeals, and ask for some emergency relief from that court. But we don't know exactly what he's going to do next. All I can tell you, Chris, is I feel really confident he's going to do something.
Okay, I think that about that, Catherine Christian. But talk a little bit more about the timing. Would it make a difference if this went over into post-January 20th, when he is, again, president of the United States, as opposed to president-elect?
Well, if he doesn't get a stay, meaning by Friday, of his sentencing, he will be sentenced. And then when he's president, he will be appealing it. The issue here is New York State criminal defendants do not get to appeal until they are sentenced. So the appellate division and the New York State Court of Appeals would be doing something for Donald Trump, President-elect Donald Trump, that no other criminal defendant would get. That's just the way it works in New York State. You can't appeal until you've been sentenced. So it'd be very rare that this stay would be granted. All of the issues that Donald Trump's lawyers are bringing up are issues that you bring up during your appeal after you have been sentenced. So he will, as Lisa said, keep trying and keep trying. But I think in terms of the state court, the appellate division, and the New York State Court of Appeals, he will not be successful in not getting sentenced by Friday. Maybe he'll have success on the federal side, but in terms of New York State, it's just the procedure. You cannot appeal until after you've been sentenced.
Catherine and Lisa, thank you both very much.
A fire is burning out of control in the Pacific Palisades neighborhood of Los Angeles, and that fast-moving fire is being fueled by a windstorm that has produced gusts of 50 to 70 miles per hour. As of right now, the fire has already burned more than 1,300 acres of land, but the wind speed is expected to peak tonight between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. local time, so there is real and significant fear that this fire could continue to spread and spread rapidly. Around 30,000 residents of the Pacific Palisades and the surrounding areas have already been evacuated. One resident told the LA Times the fire was moving so quickly that police started yelling for people to abandon their cars and telling residents to run for your lives. The LA Times is also reporting that firefighters could be heard telling dispatchers over the radio that as many as 100 abandoned vehicles were blocking the road. You can see right here that authorities had to use a bulldozer to move the parked cars out of the way in order to let the firefighters through. Right now, there are no reports of injuries or deaths, but several structures have been destroyed and the fire is continuing to grow. Joining me now is Chase Kane, who's an NBC News national climate reporter in the Pacific Palisades. Chase, thank you for doing this reporting. I know you're right in harm's way here. Can you give us a sense of what the situation is like at this hour?
Alex, the scene that you were just describing, where people were literally abandoning their cars in the road, that's Sunset Boulevard, which is just behind me here. I know it's a bit of a black hole. There's not a lot to see because they've turned off power. But that road that you're looking at is Sunset Boulevard. And then you might be able to see just on the horizon that it looks like fire, some embers may have kicked back up and started a fire again. I was actually with my producer trying to make our way down here to where we are now when the road just became gridlock. In one direction, it was people trying to evacuate from their homes. In the other direction, it was people trying to get to their homes. And once we got a little closer, we realized that was the scene, that the fire had come down the side of the hill along Sunset Boulevard, the famous Sunset Boulevard that people know all across the country. And yeah, police and firefighters were telling people, listen, either stay in your car or at some point get out of your car. So we saw people walking up the sidewalk, people evacuating their homes, Alex, pulling suitcases down the street, other people just carrying what they could under their arms. It's been a heartbreaking situation. I mean, I've covered dozens of wildfires. I've lived in Los Angeles for a while. I've never seen a wildfire that has moved this quickly and in such a densely populated area. I mean, the fact that at least no residents have been injured is certainly a miracle, although within just the last few minutes, there was a firefighter that was injured and was met by an ambulance here just behind me. It seemed like he's okay. It did not seem like it was going to be anything too serious. But, you know, these folks are out here risking their lives. As I just heard, I don't know if you can hear that on the microphone, another pop. It's probably another transformer up on the ridge line that you're seeing there. We've seen people earlier, Alex, with flashlights likely going through. That's actually a couple of like apartment and condo buildings that are on the hillside. We've seen people going through with flashlights trying to make sure no one is in there as police and fire continue to sweep this area, making sure everyone is out of harm's way, as they're also just doing what they can, because it's almost impossible to fight or contain a fire when you have winds that are 50, 60, 70 miles an hour overnight, Alex, maybe gusting up to 80 or 100. That's a hurricane force wind gust.
Yeah, I mean, the speed with which this has intensified is just staggering. I think earlier today at like 10:30 a.m. California time, there were just a few acres burning. By this afternoon, it's 1,200 acres. I would imagine the rapid spread of this has led to some of that chaos with people abandoning their cars, being told to run for their lives. Can you tell us what the evacuation process is like right now, and how wide the evacuation area is, given what you said, the wind gusts of anywhere from between 50 to 100 miles per hour that are expected tonight?
At least 30,000 people have been told to evacuate, Alex. I know it's kind of hard to tell because it just probably seems like we're in this dark place, but we're right near Santa Monica as these winds pick up and howl again. I mean, Santa Monica would typically be within eyesight of the famous pier and Ferris wheel that so many people know. Malibu is maybe just a mile up the road to the left side of your screen from where we are. This is a really densely populated area, and we're calling it the Palisades fire, but it's not just one fire burning contained. It's actually lots of little fires, because with wind like this, I mean, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to understand how it grabs one ember, and whatever that ember hits is going to catch on fire. It might be a tree, it might be brush, it might be a car parked on Sunset, which I saw. It was also houses up here on the ridgeline, at least a couple dozen homes. It's really hard for them to get a handle on exactly how bad the damage is, because this is just developing so rapidly, devolving so rapidly, I should say, Alex.
Chase Kane, our NBC News national climate reporter. Chase, please stay safe. Thank you for that excellent reporting. You are indispensable in moments like this. I'm going to go now to NBC News national correspondent Jacob Soboroff, who's also in Pacific Palisades. Jacob, I know this is your hometown, and I know Californians are used to wildfires. It's something that the governor has referred to not as wildfire season, but wildfire years in the state of California. This seems like a different order of magnitude entirely. Can you talk to me about what you're experiencing?
Well said, Alex. It seems like we're in some kind of permanent state of wildfire season in Southern California, but not like this. Not like this. This is Pacific Palisades, California. As you mentioned, it also happens to be the place that I was born and raised, up over that ridge right there. You are watching Will Rogers State Historic Park burn, and on the other side of that ridge is Palisades Village, where it's the center of the community of 23 or so thousand people who live and work and play in this very beautiful part of the city of Los Angeles. It's a community with multiple schools, restaurants, thousands and thousands of homes, and where the fire started this morning up near the Palisades Highlands, there are very few ways in and out, and that's why you heard about the cars being jammed up, people having a hard time getting out. Those bulldozers that you saw in those images earlier this evening pushing cars out of the way here on Sunset Boulevard. For people who have ever been to Los Angeles, where I'm standing right now is in between the Brentwood portion of Los Angeles and where the Palisades Village is. If you continue through the Palisades Village, you get down to the corner of Sunset and Pacific Coast Highway, which is where that staging area is, where Governor Newsom briefed the assembled media earlier tonight and made those remarks that you just mentioned. I just actually saw for the first time, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, guys, maybe embers coming in this direction, because the wind continues to shift, Alex. The wind is going essentially in a southwesterly direction from where I'm standing right now. Let's just show Alex real quick. We've got another emergency service vehicle coming through right now. This is probably the 10th or 11th one that I've seen so far. That one is from Engine 71, Los Angeles City Fire paramedic. But this is not just LA City Fire that is on this, Alex. This is a mutual aid type of situation. I've seen Los Angeles County firefighters out here, City of Santa Monica law enforcement personnel. As I mentioned to Chris Hayes in the last hour, the Los Angeles Police Department, thousands of officers strong, is on a citywide tactical alert tonight. You hear about that sometimes in volatile situations involving, protests and things like that, but not usually for a wildfire of this nature. And when I say it's different, that is because we're used to wildfires out in places like Malibu or in Malibu Canyon, where, and I don't want to minimize it, homes are destroyed and people's lives are upended and sometimes ended, but not in a place where there's tens of thousands of people living in Los Angeles. Never in my lifetime can I remember standing in Pacific Palisades and having the entire community evacuated as much of this part of Los Angeles burns tonight. Tomorrow morning is going to be a bleak scene here, and we haven't even seen the beginning of it, with winds expected to reach those peaks later tonight here, Alex.
Jacob, give me a sense of what it is like to be in the greater Los Angeles area right now, because we're hearing reports of absolute chaos in evacuated areas, people abandoning their cars abandoned on the road, bulldozed out of the way so firefighters can pass, people being told by police and first responders to run for their lives. I understand that's probably at the center of all of this, but in the surrounding areas, in not just Malibu, but in Santa Monica and in LA Central, I mean, can you talk about the level of fear, the level of panic, the sort of evacuations? And I know, you're just on the scene right now. Anecdotally speaking, set the scene for us if you could.
The road here was like, dry. How do you describe one way on the Los Angeles freeway completely gridlocked, the 405 northbound and the 405 southbound, coming from our NBC News headquarters at Universal Studios, was completely wide open. Not a soul was driving in the direction, seemed like, that we were coming to make our way here to the west side of LA. People are going as far as they can, as fast as they can, away from this part of town. And when you heard about the scenes earlier today that resulted in those cars being abandoned on the roads, it's because of the bottleneck created by the developments in places like the Palisades Highlands or at the top of streets like Bienvenido, where I lived as a young guy growing up here in Los Angeles, where there are very few ways out. There are fire roads, but those fire roads too become gridlocked or sometimes impassable. And so what people did at the beginning of this firestorm, and I think that's the only way to describe it, is to get out of their cars in places like Sunset Boulevard, outside of places like Kehillat Israel Temple, in the middle of Pacific Palisades, and just start walking, because it's a terrifying sight to behold. To stand here and to watch this, I don't quite have the words to describe to you what it's like to be standing here in this part. It's called the Palisades Riviera, and looking back at Will Rogers Park, and knowing that that's just a small portion of the fire that's burning here tonight. And it continues. When I got to this location, Alex, and we arrived here, at this part of the scene, that was a small fire that was just starting to burn. And over the course of the last hour or so that I've stood here, it has just exploded, and it seems to be exploding in all directions, which is why I said in the last hour, Chris, if there's anybody at home watching MSNBC right now, and you live in Pacific Palisades or in any of the places where there's a mandatory evacuation, get up and get out of your house and get on the road right now, because if you're inside, you're not feeling these winds right now, and you can probably see they are blowing like we don't often experience. We know the Santa Ana winds here that come in over those mountains and go out towards the coast, but this place is like a tinderbox right now.
Jacob, you're doing some essential reporting, my friend. I think it's probably made all the more complicated that this is your hometown and you grew up in Pacific Palisades. So our thoughts are with you, brother. Stay strong, and thank you for doing what you do.
Thanks, my friend.
Okay, I want you to pay attention to this one. In the span of just a few weeks, Donald Trump has floated the annexation of Canada, the takeover of the Panama Canal, and a military invasion of Mexico. And now he is turning up the heat on Greenland by threatening to hit its parent country, Denmark, with tariffs, even refusing to rule out taking the territory over by military force. Watch this.
Can you assure the world that as you try to get control of these areas, you are not going to use military or economic coercion?
No.
And can you tell us a little bit about what your plan is? Are you going to negotiate a new treaty? Are you going to ask the Canadians to hold a vote? What is the strategy?
Yeah, I can't assure you. You're talking about Panama and Greenland. No, I can't assure you on either of those two. But I can say this. We need them for economic security.
Okay, it's easy to pass this off as a joke, but Donald Trump and his allies have a lot to gain from Greenland. Greenland is home to the kind of rare earth minerals that power our smartphones and electric cars. Not only that, but Russia and China are already investing heavily in that very region. For more, I want to bring in Rufus Gifford. He served as U.S. ambassador to Denmark from 2013 to 2017. And of course, Greenland is a territory of Denmark. I'm so glad you're in town. What is your take on these threats? Because lots of people don't really know what's going on there. They're not paying attention. They're like, oh, he just talks big.
Yeah. Well, Steph, first, thank you for having me. I know it's an extraordinary day. Truthfully, I will tell you that when I heard, like the rest of the country, him threatening one of our greatest allies, truly Denmark, we've had diplomatic relationships with Denmark since the early 1800s. And the idea that we would, through tweet and press conference, before he is even sworn in as president of the United States, threaten economic, whether it's tariffs, some sort of economic penalty, or, God forbid, military action in order to occupy or sort of take over this sovereign land. Greenland is extraordinary. It is extraordinary stuff.
Why does he want it, right? This isn't a new idea. He's kind of had this fixation since 2019.
Well, look, Greenland is strategically critically important to the world, right? So it is Arctic. It's Arctic. It is ground zero of climate change. It is, without a doubt, as you said in your opening, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's rare earth minerals, there is zero doubt that Greenland is a rich source of a lot in many sources of economic. There are a lot of countries in the world that are very eager to invest in Greenland, and the United States is one of them.
Investing in Greenland is different than taking it over by military force. Don Jr., of course, Donald Trump's son, visited Greenland today, and he went with a message from his father. And the message was, quote, "We're going to treat you well." Can you explain to me, are the people of Greenland like looking for a new daddy? Like, how do they receive this?
So I speak at this as someone who's been to Greenland 9 times. I was ambassador to the Kingdom of Denmark, which includes Greenland. It's an extraordinary part of the world, Steph. It is unlike any place that most Americans have ever been. And truthfully, what I do believe they just miss the point when they go about it in the way that they have, meaning there is a rich country, there is a rich relationship that has existed for decades, for centuries between Denmark and Greenland. Greenland has, without a doubt, looking for more ways to be autonomous. That is true. But do I believe that Greenland is looking to be another colony of the United States? I think that is a stretch. I don't believe that a single Greenlandic person has necessarily said, I want to be American. Maybe some have, but when you think about that, when you think about the steps that it would take, it's actually pretty remarkable, and I just do not believe that is in the cards.
A lot of his rhetoric about Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Canada resembles the same rhetoric we hear from the Kremlin, that we need these territories for security to restore American greatness. Is that not alarming to you, that like this is what we hear from Putin?
So, there's 2 pieces on this. One, during my time as ambassador, obviously I have great friends in both Denmark and Greenland. They were, I would say, the alarm today is unlike what I've seen over the course of Donald Trump's presidency.
Alarm from whom? What do you mean?
Are my Danish friends. And I'm not talking about prime ministers and CEOs. I'm talking about average Danes, average Greenlanders, texting me saying, what is going on over there? We have been in lockstep with you. Every single time we have asked, we have lost lives in Afghanistan and Iraq. We have been with you in crisis after crisis. And here we go. And here you have an incoming president actually dictating what he thinks his relationship would be. And this is a larger issue with the way Donald Trump conducts foreign policy and the way Donald Trump conducts diplomacy. Diplomacy is this idea of soft power, right? It's about human relationships. He hasn't had a single a single relationship
and
with
Don
a Dane
Jr., of course,
or a
has no role
Greenlander.
in anything.
Of course not. No, if this was ever going to happen, which I do not believe it will, Steph, if this was ever going to happen, this would take years, and it would be about building personal relationships over the course of time. And frankly, I don't think there's anyone in either Denmark or Greenland that is interested in serving Donald Trump's ego in this way. And I believe that that's what this is.
A huge tech and media company yielding to Donald Trump's demands, ousting fact checkers, crediting Trump's election victory, and taking an unusual step of adding a Trump loyalist to its board. Now, I'm going to get into this right now. It's a striking development for information, politics, and democracy, and it would be true if this were just news about a single outlet, like a newspaper or a single news channel. But it's actually far broader. This is about Facebook's parent company, Meta, which is one of the 10 largest companies on Earth, over $1 trillion company. It reaches about 3 billion people with a B. It is, of course, run by Mark Zuckerberg, who is the third richest person on Earth. He recently met with President-elect Trump in Mar-a-Lago. This news is breaking today with a Zuckerberg video and a rollout on Fox News.
We're going to get rid of fact checkers. The recent elections also feel like a cultural tipping point.
There's an opportunity here with a new president taking office.
We're going to work with President Trump.
The message is clear. Get rid of the fact checkers that Trump doesn't like. Reflect the tipping point of the win, as Zuckerberg called it. And remember, most voters use Facebook or Instagram. So these changes will shape the information, and whether it's fact-checked or not, that most people get in this coming era. It is telling and should be noted when powerful companies proclaim they are ditching fact-checking pursuant to a political agenda. Now, studies had shown the fact-checking that is being ditched, that I just showed you, and I'm going to show you more of what Zuckerberg says, it did work. It cut down on belief in falsehoods. Zuckerberg cites Elon Musk's X in his announcement, and he cites Trump. So this isn't one of those times where we have to sort of wonder, is it a coincidence and the timing? No, Zuckerberg is making it very clear what this is for. He had previously also turned down the volume on political and civic content. If you hear people talk about algorithms and things like that, well, there are various ways that these companies basically can include more or less of something. Now, and this is important, heading towards the second Trump term, Zuckerberg says suddenly right now is the time to bring back civic posts for this new Trump era.
First, we're going to get rid of fact checkers and replace them with community notes similar to X, starting in the US. The recent elections also feel like a cultural tipping point towards once again prioritizing speech. We're bringing back civic content. For a while, the community asked to see less politics because it was making people stressed. So we stopped recommending these posts. But it feels like we're in a new era now, and we're starting to get feedback that people want to see this content again. So we're going to start phasing this back into Facebook, Instagram, and Threads.
Mark Zuckerberg is part of a company, and a company can generally run its business how they choose within the law. But this is very clearly a shift from the fact-checking Zuckerberg used to tout.
In 2016, we began to face new kinds of threats, and after years of preparation, we were ready to defend against them. We've built sophisticated systems to protect against election interference, and we introduced new policies to combat voter suppression and misinformation. Still, the pandemic created new challenges: how to handle misinformation about COVID and voting by mail, how to prepare people for the reality that results would take time. We worked with local election officials to remove false claims about polling conditions that might lead to voter suppression. We partnered with Reuters and the National Election Pool to provide reliable information about results. We attached voting information.
And on he went. And that was just 4 years ago. And if you, again, listen to the substance of what he's saying, the point here is not whether he's the most perfect video presenter ever. That doesn't matter. It's not how he's built his power or his very effective company. What he was saying there was we're working with elections officials, not just people posting made-up stuff. And we're working with Reuters and other reliable press outlets. That was just 4 years ago. So what's changed? It's our job here to be as fair and open-minded as possible. We don't have a brain scan or a lie detector of what moved Zuckerberg, although I've shown you there are business pressures. I've shown you there were threats from the incoming president-elect. We've heard a lot of debate about whether to take Donald Trump literally or figuratively, and what we do when we have an incoming leader who speaks so openly about abusing power, which would be unconstitutional, whatever the Supreme Court has said. If you are still an officer in the United States and you are asked to, say, use federal powers or weapons against, say, a peaceful opposition, that's an unlawful order. You're not supposed to carry it out. But we have someone who's been talking about that, jailing opponents, jailing Liz Cheney, jailing Mark Zuckerberg. Has that affected Zuckerberg? Is that why we're seeing this big change of heart? Is it the other business pressures I mentioned? Is it reaction to the threats? We have an update on this today. The president-elect was asked, I should say, and then he answered on this very question during the press conference on his view today.
Do you think he's directly responding to the threats that you have made to him in the past? With
Probably. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, probably. That's the sitting incoming president saying probably with regard to the question about Zuckerberg. And so tonight I have to say, if that is incorrect, it is up to Mark Zuckerberg to respond. He just shared his video today. The president-elect just spoke. And even if Facebook is giving up on certain fact-checking, Mr. Zuckerberg has a duty as a business leader with a fiduciary duty to the company and the users, and as a citizen, really, to just be honest about what's going on. So in addition to my reporting tonight, I have to say, Mark, is the president-elect right? Did you do this over his threats or not? There are many people facing pressures far more severe than Mr. Zuckerberg with far less capital, bodyguards, lawyers, and the rest. From the Capitol Police, who fought off Trump's violent fans 4 years ago in a day, to Liz Cheney or other public servants who I mentioned. Mark Zuckerberg is the third richest person in the world. He ought to be able to speak about the basic facts here rather than being stunned or scared into silence. And to leave this unaddressed is to basically close the circle and leave the impression that the president-elect is right and he was threatened into this. And again, there are a lot of people in a lot more vulnerable positions or more difficult positions who've shown plenty of courage. All Mr. Zuckerberg has to do is tell the truth. Were you threatened into this or not? Facebook has this enormous power or information. It shapes what people see, whether they're looking to discuss democracy, politics, or not. And they've had other problems that have nothing to do with partisanship. We've covered this repeatedly. We did a multi-part series on Facebook on this show, if you saw that back in the day. Zuckerberg apologized at a Senate hearing about their failures on children's online safety. Amnesty found that poor moderation, basically erring on the side of allowing things to go up immediately, contributed to hate crimes, to mass violence. And again, this isn't just about red, blue America. This is a huge issue all over the world, as we have covered. When you go back to 2016, which first sparked many of these debates, Facebook acknowledged that when it came to misinformation going into 2016, it wasn't a million or two people. It was over 100 million Americans who were exposed to foreign election propaganda, which we should be concerned about as Americans, not red or blue, but just that we ought to make these decisions with our own facts among our own citizens and not allow our companies and seeking profits to let foreign governments hijack our minds, our information, our phones, or our elections. Well, Zuckerberg did, I want to note, ultimately apologize for all that. He initially said that he opposed the criticism that it was crazy to say they had any election problem, but then he said after the election, I made that comment. I thought the idea that misinformation on Facebook changed the outcome of the election was a, quote, crazy idea. Calling that, quote, crazy was dismissive, and I regret it. He said, this was 2017, quote, this is too important an issue to be dismissive. And the Senate, in its own way, has brought him and other tech executives forward, where he also spoke on this.
It's clear now that we didn't do enough to prevent these tools from being used for harm as well. And that goes for fake news, for foreign interference in elections and hate speech, as well as developers and data privacy. We didn't take a broad enough view of our responsibility, and that was a big mistake. And it was my mistake, and I'm sorry. I started Facebook, I run it, and I'm responsible for what happens here.
Yes, you are. That was 2018. So one strand of this story might just be the typical business thing, and one of the reasons why we've covered how so many Americans across the spectrum are fed up and done with the profiteering, greed, hypocrisy, and lies of so many leaders in business. Because I've just shown you, took a couple minutes, hope you stayed with me, but I showed you through a couple minutes the zigging and the zagging and the back and forth, and none of these things are internally consistent. So maybe it's just a business version of how people who make their priority just building the biggest business possible, if that's their priority, everything else comes second, and they will say and do all sorts of things to just keep it moving. And that's a business thing, and that's something we have to cover. But the other piece of this, the unanswered question from Mr. Zuckerberg tonight after the president-elect called him out and said, yep, I control that guy. I threatened him into this. Are you going to respond to that? Are you going to speak up for that? Are you going to be one of the richest, most powerful people in the world and not even be able to use your voice through your lawyer or your spokesperson or another video to address whether you have the ability and the fortitude to stand up during a time where there are people, including apparently the president-elect, announcing that their threats and their abuse of power, their threats to do it, are going to change the way millions and hundreds of millions of people get information and facts at a time when you're ditching fact-checking and our democracy, in a very real way, could be the victim.
Joining me now, MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, NBC News Justice and Intelligence correspondent Ken Dilanian, MSNBC legal analyst Barbara McQuaid, Washington Post White House reporter Tyler Pager, and our political analyst, Boston Globe columnist Kimberly Atkins Storr, also an attorney. Lisa, a lot of legal developments just in the last hour while the president was speaking. He attacked Jack Smith. He attacked Judge Merchan. He attacked the whole prosecution. He misstated a lot of the facts. But there have been developments, specifically Judge Cannon's ruling. Can you explain also the emergency hearing this hour?
Well, Andrea, let's start with Judge Cannon's ruling. As you noted, Judge Cannon ruled today that she is going to impose a stay on the release of any special counsel report. And according to her order today, that not only applies to the report itself, but also to any information contained in that report. And in both instances, she says Jack Smith, Attorney General Merrick Garland, and Department of Justice employees and agents and those of the special counsel's office are precluded from sharing either the report or any information contained therein beyond the Department of Justice itself. That theoretically means that, for example, when the 11th Circuit decides that they want to have a crack at this, that those actors will be precluded from even sharing with the 11th Circuit itself, the superior decision maker, the information about the report or even a draft report so that they can make a decision here. It's not clear to folks like me, Andrea, whether she has jurisdiction, and that's because earlier this year she threw out the Mar-a-Lago documents case, explaining that from her reasoning, Jack Smith did not have constitutional authority to bring that prosecution under the Appointments Clause of the Constitution. And so there is no basis here to block the report, in part because it's not clear that there's a case or controversy in front of her. But even if there were, the argument that Trump is making that presidential immunity also precludes the release of the report is really a stretch of the Supreme Court's ruling earlier this year. The Supreme Court finding that a president cannot be prosecuted, as you know, for acts having to do with his presidency while he is a sitting president. But here they are trying to say that it has to do with the transition period, and therefore during the transition period he should also be protected, and that he should be protected because this would subject him to some sort of peculiar public opprobrium. You know, Andrea, you and I and others on this network have been discussing the facts at the heart of the Mar-a-Lago documents case since June of 2023, when that indictment was first issued. based on what Ken's reporting and others, our understanding is that this report wouldn't contain any new information, much less subject the president to opprobrium publicly or force him to expend a great deal of time and energy combating information in the report. So for all of those reasons, it's unclear to me why Judge Cannon has done what she has done. The one final thing that I'll leave you with is that her stay of the release of the report extends beyond any decision by the 11th Circuit. She says that the stay she's imposing will last for 3 days longer. It's unclear to me also why she's done that, but one possibility is that the 11th Circuit doesn't sit again until next week, starting on the 14th of next week and going through the 17th. Could it be that she is trying to impose a stay that would last beyond the time at which Donald Trump is inaugurated? That's one possibility here, Andrea.
No, absolutely. The calendar is there. And right now, Todd Blanche, the president's defense lawyer, is in the lobby of the appeals court looking over his documents because they are about to appeal the sentencing issue, which was supposed to take place Friday. Barbara McQuade, if you could sort out, being a professor and understanding the appellate situation here, who has jurisdiction, the 11th Circuit or what's going on in Washington over the January 6th portion of what is a legally mandated report to Merrick Garland, the Attorney General, that is then supposed to be shared with Congress, as I understand it, at the conclusion of a special prosecution. And since the cases have been dismissed at his own direction, given the immunity decisions and time running out, what would stop that report on January 6th from being released by Judge Cannon, since she has only jurisdiction over the classified documents case?
Yeah, you raise a really good point, Andrea. I don't think she has any jurisdiction over it, but delay is the name of the game here. If they can just stop the clock until January 20th, then the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, will be a Trump appointee, and they can kill the whole thing and say there's no report to disclose. So that's the goal here. I think it to me seems that Judge Cannon does not have jurisdiction over this case. I know Lisa said it's not clear that she does. I think she does not, but they'd have to go to the 11th Circuit to sort that out. They're not going to sit until next week. If they can just delay that long enough, the Justice Department would be in violation of a court order to release this. Now, that's the Mar-a-Lago piece of it. I think it has been reported that there are 2 volumes of this report. So the January 6th piece of this is governed by the judge in Washington, D.C., Tanya Chutkan, who has denied this motion to dismiss the case on the basis of the special counsel regulations, although recall that in that case, the case has been dismissed without prejudice. So she also seems to be lacking in jurisdiction. I think probably at the end of the day, the most important thing that happens here is under the special counsel regulations, the executive branch is permitted to share this with the legislative branch because courts should not be intervening there as a matter of separation of powers.
So if Merrick Garland Ken Dilanian wants to release this January 6th report, could he do that without being in violation of a court order?
Not right now, Andrea. I could tell you, let me just clear up a few things. One, the Justice Department is taking this order very seriously. It's an order by a federal judge. They believe it's binding on them until they can get it lifted, and they're discussing and contemplating how to do that right now. It applies to both volumes of the report, not just the classified documents portion, but the January 6th portion as well. And according to the Justice Department officials I talked to, that's how they're viewing it. And there is a legitimate issue at the heart of this, and that's why the DOJ is saying it may not be able to release the classified documents portion of the report at all, no matter what Judge Cannon does, because there's a local rule in the Southern District of Florida, 77.2, which talks about releasing information pertaining to a pending criminal case outside of a trial. And DOJ lawyers looked at that. It was first raised by the lawyers for Donald Trump's co-defendants, and they said, yeah, that seems to apply here. It's a problem for us. There are pending criminal charges against 2 of Donald Trump's aides, Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira.
Can the prosecution drop the cases against those co-defendants in order to lift that, to make that rule not pertain to
well, in theory, they could do that. They're appealing. The reason they haven't done that is they're appealing what they view as a bad order by Judge Cannon, saying that the way they selected the special counsel was unconstitutional. So that's on appeal. But if Donald Trump's Justice Department comes in and drops those cases, as we believe is likely to happen, then this report will be subject to the Freedom of Information Act, and you and I could sue to try to get it. But what I was saying is that the Justice Department has concluded that they may not be able to release Jack Smith's report about the classified documents portion of this case. They do believe, though, that Judge Cannon really has no jurisdiction over the January 6th portion, which, as Barbara said, was brought in Washington, D.C. But right now they have to get some courts to say that, to countermand Judge Cannon's order, which they believe right now applies to them, and they can't even talk about this stuff, let alone release it, Andrea.
And could they release it to Congress as is mandated?
Not according to this order. They can't talk about it or release it outside of the Justice Department. And the judge made clear that this order should be served on Merrick Garland as soon as practicable. So, look, they're taking it very seriously. It's an order of a federal judge. How long it will be in place is another question, Andrea.
Okay, Susan, Don Jr. in Greenland, as his father keeps on talking about this idea of acquiring the territory. Seems like it might be a little bit of trolling, but should we take it seriously?
No, we shouldn't take it seriously. I think Donald Trump Jr. actually put it perfectly, having a little fun. I think they're all having a little fun at our expense. And frankly, it's a way of not talking about things like, I don't know, Kash Patel and other nominees to his cabinet have been getting a lot of bad press. And now we've had this little break and we're talking about Greenland and canals and Canada becoming a state, none of which is going to happen. But it is a good deflection.
But why the focus? And I want to get your take, Richard, because it's not just Greenland. As Susan pointed out, he's also been talking about Canada becoming a new American state, trolling Justin Trudeau, calling him governor. 2 weeks from the inauguration. What do you make of it?
Look, Trump loves picking fights. He loves bullying. But let's not forget that respecting sovereignty is a cornerstone of the U.S. foreign policy. It's why we're backing Ukraine. It's why we have NATO. So what does Trump do? He plays footsie with all these tyrants in China, Russia, and North Korea. And he, makes a mockery of our allies. And I think people will be reminded, certainly our foreign leaders, of the time that they laughed about Trump behind his back at a NATO meeting while Trump was president after he had left because he had made such a fool out of himself. And I think that's what he's reminding these foreign leaders of and the American public of how foolish he can be because he thinks in his own addled way that somehow this brings glory to him. But I think that is short-sighted.
That's such a great point. And just to add on to that, because I was being a little flippant, I admit. But to be serious about it, it'll be interesting how someone like Marco Rubio will now handle these relationships and things that come up. So
he may be asked about it next week at his confirmation hearing. You never know. Meantime, Susan, Trump is also claiming that Biden is doing everything possible to make the transition as difficult as possible. His words, and he alleges what he calls lawfare. He cites new executive orders. Meanwhile, Trump's incoming White House chief of staff, Susie Wiles, really paints a picture of things going pretty smoothly. She tells Axios Biden's chief of staff has been very helpful. He's made great suggestions, helped make sure we stay on time and with required functions, helped us navigate the labyrinth that is the executive office of the president, and has been very professional. Even says he invited her for dinner at his house. What's your read on Trump's claim that President Biden is trying to make things as difficult as possible?
That's Trump letting loose. There's some things, executive actions that, of course, he does not approve of, but he'll be able to change those when he gets back into office. But what I think is interesting is Susie Wiles in that interview basically said she never tried to manage the president, just the campaign. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what she's saying when it comes to Trump. What he does on Truth Social is his thing, and she's not going to try and manage that. But it doesn't mean that the incoming White House chief of staff can't manage the office and see to the particulars and see that things are getting done. And we've also heard from the Biden side that the Trump folks have been responsive, especially on foreign policy.
On this idea of managing Trump, though, it's interesting you bring that up because we have some new reporting just this morning that Susie Wiles is trying to limit the number of people who have access to Donald Trump in the White House in terms of the number of assistants to the president, to make fewer people. How could that make a difference in terms of the new Trump administration, Richard?
Well, it's not going to happen. I mean, they all have his cell number, and that's when he's at his kind of most self-referential as when he's calling members of Congress and having these chats and trying to influence policy. And we all know one day it's a big, beautiful bill, and next day it's 2 bills. Look, the fact of the matter is Trump's putting this on Biden, so when he gets off to a slow start, which seems totally predictable, let's not forget it wasn't long ago that they said by the inauguration they wanted to have one of these big bills done. And now they're talking April, and we all know it's going to be June, July, or maybe September before they actually get it done. So this is a way for him to kind of pass the buck and say, I would have done great except for Biden tied my hands, which is nonsense.
Guys, I want to shift gears for a minute and ask you about pardons. Trump has repeatedly promised to pardon January 6 rioters, and now a former Proud Boys founder, leader, Enrique Tarrio, is asking for a pardon specifically. He was sentenced to 22 years in prison for his seditious conspiracy conviction. That's the lengthiest sentence of any of the January 6 defendants. Do you think that is even perhaps a bridge too far for Trump, Susan?
It could be because of the issues with law enforcement around it. And let's not forget, Donald Trump just needs to pardon some people for him to, in his mind, to have matched that campaign promise. He did say it would be on a case, he'd have to look at it case by case. So that may be a case that doesn't get it, or maybe he commutes the sentence. I don't know. And it doesn't have to happen day 1. It could happen on the last day of year 4. So this is him, Trump, definitely saying, I will make good on a campaign promise, but we have to see who he actually pardons.
And Richard, you're a lawyer. What's your take?
He can pardon any of these people, right? But I don't see how you go, we back the blue when you're pardoning people who have killed the blue. Right. The Capitol Police chief said that what is the statement that this makes if you pardon people who are beating up cops? We've had Republican-appointed judges in D.C. who have called this preposterous, and we see from the polls that 60% or more of Americans are dead set against the notion of pardoning these people. So, Trump's a huckster. If he talks his way out of this one, go for it. I don't see it.